midnight special. I should have known something was off about Benny's Diner the moment I walked through the door. The place looked normal enough. Retro booths, checkered floors, and that lingering scent of grease and burnt coffee. But something in the air felt wrong, stale, like time had stopped moving inside. I was desperate for a job, though, and when I saw the "Help Wanted Night Shift Only" sign in the window, I didn't hesitate. Benny himself, an older guy with tired eyes and a permanent scowl, hired me on the spot. No interview, no paperwork. "The job's easy," he said, wiping his hands on a grease-stained rag. "Just watch the place, clean up, and serve anyone who comes in." I asked how many customers they usually got overnight. Benny just chuckled. "Not many. My first shift started at 11 p.m. Benny handed me the keys, muttered something about not touching the basement door, and walked out, leaving me alone under the flickering fluorescent lights. First, it wasn't so bad. I wiped down tables, restocked the condiments, and stared at the empty parking lot through the big front window. Hours passed without a single soul walking through the door. Around 2 a.m., I started to get the feeling that I wasn't alone. Couldn't shake it. It was like someone was watching me, just out of sight. Every time I turned, I swore I saw movement in the corner of my eye, shadows that shouldn't be there. Then the bell above the door jingled. I nearly jumped out of my skin. A man walked in, pale, gone. He wore an old suit, the kind you'd see in black and white movies, and his eyes, they looked dead. He didn't say a word as he slid into the last booth at the back. I hesitated, swallowing the lump in my throat before grabbing a menu and approaching. "Welcome to Benny's. Can I get you something?" He didn't even look at me, just rasped, "The midnight special." I blinked. "I don't think we have." But before I could finish, the overhead lights dimmed, and the jukebox, unplugged and covered in dust, started playing on its own. Some eerie old tune that sent chills down my spine. My stomach churned. I fumbled for my notepad and scribbled down "midnight special," hurrying back to the kitchen. I had no idea what a midnight special was, but as soon as I stepped into the kitchen, the air turned icy. The smell of rotting meat filled my nose, and the frying station flickered to life by itself. The deep fryer bubbled violently, grease popping in the air like it was waiting for something. And then, my hands started moving. I swear to God, I wasn't in control. I reached into the walk-in freezer, grabbing things I'd never seen before. Things I shouldn't have seen. Slimy, gray meat. Something that looked suspiciously like a severed hand. Though when I blinked, it was just a lump of dough. The whole time, I could feel something breathing down my neck. I didn't turn around. I plated the food without knowing what I was doing. A greasy, grotesque mess that stank of copper and mold. But it looked perfect, like it belonged here. I carried the plate out to the man in the booth. He smiled at me. His teeth were too sharp. He dug in without hesitation, devouring the meal in disgusting, slurping bites. I backed away slowly, trying not to gag. The jukebox was still playing. I don't know how long I stood there watching, but when he finally looked up at me, his eyes were black, entirely black. He pushed the empty plate forward. Good. Then he stood up and walked out, disappearing into the night. After that, things got worse. Every night, the diner attracted more customers. They came in silently, sitting in that same back booth, ordering the midnight special without fail. And I couldn't say no. I couldn't stop cooking, even when the meat in the freezer started looking more and more human. The worst part, I started getting used to it. Some nights, I'd wake up in my apartment and find grease under my nails, the stench of rot in my clothes, like the diner was seeping into my real life. I tried to quit. Benny wouldn't let me. "You signed up for this," he said, his tired eyes darker than before. "Just serve, and don't ask questions." I asked him what would happen if I refused. He didn't answer. Then came the night I made a mistake. A woman came in, young, terrified, wearing a torn-up dress like she'd been running for miles. She grabbed my wrist, nails digging in deep. "Please, don't let them in," she whispered. I glanced outside and saw them, a group of figures, standing in the fog, staring through the windows with empty eyes. They didn't move. The bell jingled, but no one walked in. They just stood there, waiting. "Don't serve them," the woman begged. "Once you serve them, they own you." I didn't know what to do. My hands were trembling, and I felt that familiar pull toward the kitchen. I can't," I stammered. Suddenly, the figures outside were inside. The diner felt smaller, darker. The woman screamed as their hands grabbed her, pulling her back toward the door. "Don't serve them." And then, she was gone. I was alone again, but something told me I wasn't getting out. That was a week ago. Now I'm still here, trapped in Benny's, cooking the midnight special night after night, feeding customers who aren't human. They come in, silent and hungry, and I serve them because I have no choice. And every night, I hear whispers coming from the basement. I don't know what's down there, but I'm scared to find out. I think Benny's known all along. I think he was once like me, and I know that sooner or later, someone else will see the help wanted sign and take the job, just like I did. The last shift at Marlowe's Diner. I took the job at Marlowe's Diner because I needed the cash. It was a hole-in-the-wall place off the highway, the kind of spot truckers and late-night wanderers pass through on their way to somewhere else. The owner, Mr. Marlowe, was a quiet old man with an unsettling stare and a permanent scowl. He barely said a word during my interview, just told me to show up for the night shift and handed me an apron. I should have listened to the rumors. People said weird things about the place, that it had been around forever, that sometimes people went in and never came out. I laughed it off. Small town gossip, I thought, but I was wrong. My first few nights were uneventful. Just endless hours of refilling coffee cups and wiping down the same greasy counters over and over. But tonight was different. It started with the lights. The fluorescent bulbs above the counter flickered, buzzing like angry insects. I looked up from the grill, spatula in hand, and frowned. "Cheap wiring," I muttered. Mr. Marlowe sat in his usual booth by the window, nursing a cup of black coffee and staring out into the night. He didn't seem to notice. The clock on the wall read 12:06 a.m., just 6 more hours to go. I turned back to the grill and flipped a burger patty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. When I glanced over my shoulder, the diner was empty except for Mr. Marlowe. Yet, there was a shadow. It lingered just beyond the edge of the booths, barely visible in the dim neon glow from the open sign outside. I blinked, and it was gone. A chill ran down my spine. An hour later, the doorbell jingled. A customer finally. A man walked in, tall, thin, dressed in an old-fashioned suit. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes. There was something off about them. "Welcome to Marlowe's," I said, forcing a smile. "What can I get you?" He didn't respond. Instead, he slid into a booth, folding his hands neatly on the table. I grabbed my notepad and approached, but before I could speak, he looked up at me. "Do you believe in second chances?" His voice was soft but unnerving, like it came from far away. I blinked. "Excuse me?" He tilted his head. "Sometimes places like this, they give you a second chance." I forced a nervous chuckle. Coffee?" The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Sure, black." I hurried behind the counter, poured the coffee, and when I turned around, his booth was empty. The door hadn't opened. The bell hadn't rung, but the coffee cup sat there steaming. I glanced at Mr. Marlowe, but he didn't react. He just kept staring out the window. "Did you see that guy?" I asked, wiping my hands on my apron. Mr. Marlowe finally spoke. His voice was low and scratchy. "Ain't no guy." I froze. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer, just sipped his coffee. I went to clear the booth where the man had been sitting, but the seat was ice cold, like no one had been there at all. I reached for the coffee cup, and as my fingers brushed the handle, the lights flickered again. Only this time, they stayed off. Darkness swallowed the diner. "Damn it," I muttered, fumbling for my phone. The flashlight cast long, eerie shadows across the walls. Power outage? A whisper slithered through the darkness. "You shouldn't be here." My heart nearly stopped. "Who's there?" I called, voice trembling. No answer. Only the creak of the floorboards. I turned the flashlight toward the booths. The tables were empty except for one. In the farthest corner, a figure sat with its back to me, hunched over, hands resting on the table. It wasn't Mr. Marlowe. I took a step closer and the figure twitched. A long, rasping breath filled the silence. Then slowly it turned its head. My blood ran cold. Its face was wrong, stretched too thin, eyes sunken deep into dark sockets. Its mouth moved, but the words were garbled, inhuman. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair. "Stay away!" The figure lunged forward, but before it could reach me, the lights snapped back on. I blinked against the sudden brightness, heart hammering in my chest. And just like that, the figure was gone. Mr. Marlowe stood by the counter now, watching me with those cold, dead eyes. "You should go home, son." I wiped sweat from my forehead. What the hell is wrong with this place? He didn't answer. I grabbed my jacket, ready to bolt, but the diner door wouldn't budge. The bell jingled softly, but the door stayed locked, as if something on the other side didn't want me to leave. My reflection in the glass looked off, like it was smiling even though my face wasn't. I banged on the door, panic rising. "Let me out!" Mr. Marlowe's voice cut through the silence. "They don't like it when you try to leave." I turned back to him. Who are they?" He looked past me toward the booths. "The ones who stayed too long." I backed away from the door, heart pounding. The diner felt smaller now, the walls pressing in, the ceiling lower. The booths looked different, older, decayed, like they'd been abandoned for decades. The smell of rot filled the air. I stumbled toward the counter, but my reflection in the metal surface was all wrong. It smiled at me again, and whispered, "Stay." I don't remember much after that. Just running through the aisles, past the counter, past Mr. Marlowe's lifeless stare. Somehow, I ended up outside, the cold night air hitting my face like a slap. The diner stood silent behind me, looking just like it always did. The neon sign flickered. Marlowe's Diner, open 24 hours. But when I looked through the window, I saw myself inside, still behind the counter, still trapped, and I was smiling. The last table at Vincent's Diner. I should have never taken that late shift at Vincent's Diner. It was supposed to be just another job, a way to make some cash while I figured out my life. I wasn't looking for excitement, just a steady paycheck and maybe a free meal here and there. The place was old, a relic from the 60s, with cracked vinyl booths and a flickering neon sign that read Vincent's, open all night. The stories about the place didn't bother me at first. Every town has its local legends, right? Disappearances, strange noises in the back room, the rumor that the diner hadn't been remodeled in decades because, well, something wouldn't let them. I laughed it off, until last night. It was around 1:30 a.m. when the bell above the door jingled, and a man walked in. I was standing behind the counter, wiping down a coffee cup that had probably been dirty since before I was born. The guy was weird, tall, thin, dressed in a black suit that looked like it belonged in another century. He didn't speak at first, just slid into the corner booth, the one everyone avoided. The last table, as we called it. Nobody ever sat there. I walked over, pen poised above my notepad. "Evening. What can I get you?" He looked up at me, and my stomach clenched. His face, something was wrong with it. His features were too sharp, too defined, like a wax figure come to life. His eyes were black, no whites, no irises, just deep, endless voids. "I'll have the special," he said, voice too smooth, like it had been rehearsed 1,000 times. I forced a smile. Sure, coming right up." When I walked back to the kitchen, my coworker, Janine, gave me a look. "Who's the guy?" she whispered. I shrugged. "Just some night owl, I guess." Janine shook her head. "You know what they say about that table, right?" I laughed it off. "You mean that stupid ghost story?" She didn't laugh. "Don't mess around, okay? I swear, I heard someone talking back there last week when the place was empty. I rolled my eyes and pushed through the swinging kitchen door. As I prepped the special, a greasy burger and fries combo, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air in the kitchen felt heavier, like the grease had seeped into the walls. When I glanced through the order window, the man was staring at me. He hadn't touched his coffee. I blinked. He was gone. I rushed out into the dining area. The booth was empty. The bell above the door never rang. I glanced at Janine, my throat dry. "Did you see him leave?" She frowned. "Who?" I pointed at the booth, my hands shaking. "The guy in the suit." Janine gave me a weird look. "Dude, nobody came in." I sat behind the counter, rubbing my temples. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe the diner's creepy reputation was getting to me. The clock ticked past 2 a.m. That's when the real weird stuff started happening. First, the radio crackled. Janine had left it on low, playing some oldie station, but the signal cut out. Static filled the air, and beneath it, I swear I heard whispering. Not words, but something low and rhythmic like chanting. "Janine," I called, my voice unsteady. No answer. I stepped out from behind the counter and into the dining area. The booths stretched into the distance, longer than they should be. The lights flickered overhead. The clock on the wall had stopped. Then the smell hit me. A rancid, cloying stench like rotting meat covered my nose, gagging. "Janine?" From the farthest booth, the last table, a figure was sitting there again. The man in the black suit. Only this time he wasn't alone. A woman sat across from him, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, eyes wide and lifeless. She didn't blink. She didn't move. My legs felt frozen in place, but I forced myself to step closer. "Sir?" My voice trembled. "Are you okay?" His lips curled into a thin smile. "The special's gone cold." I turned to run, but the diner wasn't the same anymore. The booths stretched endlessly, looping in impossible directions. The floor beneath me felt soft, like I was standing on something that breathed. And Janine, she was nowhere. I stumbled toward the exit, but the door wouldn't budge. The neon open sign flickered violently, casting shadows that moved on their own. Behind me, the man in the suit stood, his shoes clicking against the tiled floor. "You shouldn't have stayed," he said, voice too close to my ear. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty diner and the cold plate of food still sitting on the table. And then I heard it, a scraping sound, like fingernails against metal. I turned slowly. The woman in the booth wasn't sitting anymore. She was crawling toward me, her limbs jerking unnaturally, her mouth stretched into a silent scream. Her fingers scraped across the floor, leaving streaks of something dark and wet. I bolted toward the kitchen, heart hammering. I slammed the door behind me and shoved a chair under the handle. My breath came in ragged gasps. I grabbed my phone, hands trembling. No signal. The kitchen was darker than before, the lights barely flickering. Something dripped from the ceiling. A dark stain spread across the tiles, pulsing like it was alive. I could hear them on the other side of the door. The scraping, the whispering. "Leave me alone!" I screamed. The whispering stopped. Then, a soft knock. "Your order is ready," the voice said from the other side. I grabbed the biggest knife I could find, holding it tightly. And then the power went out completely. I don't remember how I got out. 1 second, I was in the kitchen, trapped. The next, I was outside in the parking lot, the neon sign flickering above me. The diner looked normal, empty. Janine was gone. I never went back. A week later, I drove by late at night. The diner was still there, lights on, but something was different. The last table, there were 2 people sitting there, a man in a suit, and Janine. They both turned and smiled at me as I sped away. The Hollow Fork Diner. I don't know why I answered the ad. Overnight shift available at the Hollow Fork Diner. Good pay. Must be okay with working alone. I wasn't desperate for cash, but I guess curiosity got the better of me. The diner was infamous in our town. People said it was haunted. Some folks swore they saw shadows moving in the windows long after closing. and others whispered about a waitress who disappeared from the night shift back in the 90s. No one found her, just her uniform crumpled in a booth. I figured it was all just urban legend nonsense, and besides, I'd worked late nights before. What could really go wrong? My first shift started at 10 p.m. The manager, an older guy named Carl, gave me the rundown. The place was a relic from the 70s. Faded checkered floors, red vinyl booths, and the sickly sweet smell of stale coffee that never quite went away. The register's simple, Carl said, barely looking at me. No one really comes in this late. You might get a trucker or two, but mostly it's quiet. That should have been my first clue. No restaurant is ever that quiet. As Carl left, I locked the front doors behind him, looking out at the empty parking lot. The diner stood alone on the edge of town, surrounded by nothing but highway and dense patches of forest. The neon sign buzzed outside. The Hollow Fork, open 24 hours. I sighed, settling in behind the counter with a cup of black coffee. The clock on the wall read 11:03 p.m. I figured I could kill some time on my phone, but the moment I sat down, the jukebox started playing. I froze, the cup halfway to my lips. It was an old tune, something jazzy and out of place. The weird thing was, I hadn't touched the jukebox. It hadn't worked for years, according to Carl. I walked over and unplugged it, muttering to myself, just old wiring. Nothing weird. Midnight rolled around, and the diner was dead silent again. I wiped down the counters, trying to ignore how the fluorescent lights flickered slightly. Every time I looked up, it felt like the booths were off, like they had shifted, subtly rearranging themselves when I wasn't watching. I was cleaning up one of the tables near the window when I noticed something outside. At first, it looked like a trick of the light, a figure standing by the edge of the woods, just beyond the reach of the neon glow. My heart hammered. I squinted. The figure didn't move. I wiped my sweaty palms on my apron and decided to ignore it. Probably a tree. I turned back toward the counter, but a bell jingled. The door. I hadn't unlocked it. A woman stood just inside, dripping wet. Her hair clung to her face in stringy locks. Her clothes stuck to her skin like she'd been standing in a downpour. But the sky outside was clear. Can I get you something? I asked, voice shaking. She didn't answer, just walked, barefoot, to a booth in the far corner. The last booth. My gut told me not to go over there, but I did anyway. She looked up at me with hollow eyes, her lips twitching. Coffee. I nodded, hurrying back to the counter. My hands shook as I poured the cup, spilling a little onto the saucer. When I turned back, she was staring at me, not blinking. She hadn't even touched the coffee. Time crawled by. At some point, I heard a soft tapping. I looked toward the window and nearly dropped the coffee pot. There were hands pressed against the glass, pale, bony fingers leaving greasy smears against the surface. The fog outside seemed to deepen, swallowing the parking lot, hiding everything beyond a few feet. Then the jukebox turned on again. But this time, it wasn't music. It was whispering, low, overlapping voices that filled the diner. I backed up, pressing against the counter, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The woman in the booth was smiling now, but it wasn't right. Her lips curled too wide, teeth too sharp. The coffee's cold, she whispered. I bolted for the back room. I fumbled with my phone in the kitchen, trying to call Carl, but the screen only displayed static. The walls around me felt tighter, like the room was getting smaller. Then came the smell, rotten, sour, like something had died in the vents. And then, I heard the bell above the door again. Someone else had come in. Or something. I peeked through the small window in the kitchen door. The diner was filled now. The booths, once empty, were occupied by figures dressed in old-fashioned clothing. They sat unnervingly still, heads bowed, faces shrouded in shadow. They didn't eat. They didn't move. The woman in the corner booth stood, turning slowly to face me. And then she laughed. The sound wasn't human. It was layered, like multiple voices speaking at once, twisting around each other. "I think you're on the menu tonight," she whispered, stepping closer to the counter. I ran. I burst through the kitchen's back door into the alley behind the diner, my breath ragged. The cold air burned my lungs as I sprinted to my car, fumbling with my keys. Behind me, the diner's lights flickered violently, and through the window, I could still see them. All of them, sitting in their booths, heads turning in perfect unison to watch me. I finally got the car started and tore out of the lot. When I went back the next day with the cops, the diner was normal. No sign of the woman, no figures in the booths. But the weirdest thing, Carl swore up and down that I had never worked there, said he never put out an ad. And when I checked my phone later, the job listing was gone, like it had never existed. But every time I pass the Hollow Fork at night, I swear I see someone sitting in that last booth, smiling.